Hey there, it's Mia, and I'm just jumping into your ears before the episode starts to check in and see how you're going. We all had so many plans, didn't we, for what our March and our April and our May 2020 was going to look like and how life was going to go. And that includes At No Filter. We had a lot of episodes that we were really excited to bring to you, and we still are excited to bring them to you. But they are not all COVID related, and I think that that's important. We want to balance some special episodes that pertain to what we're all going through right now that are going to be coming up in your feed with some of what you love about No Filter, which is extraordinary stories with incredible people. And that's what we've got for you today. In fact, Susan Francis's story is so incredible. As you're going to hear, we've spaced it out over 2 episodes. So if you're looking for news about Corona, of course, you can find that at mamamia.com.au or on our daily news podcast, The Quickie. But we will be here week after week, sometimes twice a week, with other things, with diversion, distraction, and moments of joy and entertainment, because we all have to get through this in lots of different ways. And I just wanted to say that we're here for you. Sending love to everyone and take care. Enjoy the episode.
We were sitting there and I remember the waitress came over to get us coffee and she said something like, "Oh, it's so nice for 2 sisters to have time to have coffee together." So it was the first time anyone had acknowledged a physical appearance between me and somebody else, and also the biological link that we shared. So it was amazing. She was a very soft person and she felt like my sister, to tell you the truth.
Never has the cliche, truth is stranger than fiction, applied more than to the life of the woman that you're about to meet. You really couldn't make Susan Francis's life up. It is that extraordinary. It begins with an adoption story and mystery of her biological parents. It includes a secret sister, a heartbreaking confrontation, a tragedy, unexpected love, and a series of events that were so dramatic that she had to write them down in a memoir just to make sense of them. It's called The Love That Remains. And Susan is such a wonderful and engaging storyteller with such a big story to tell, and she tells it so beautifully and warmly. I didn't want to skip any of the bits, so to do her story and her justice, this No Filter is actually going to be in 2 parts. Today's episode is about the mystery of Susan's adoption, and it's an adoption and reunion story unlike any you've heard before. Here's Susan Francis. Susan, when did you find out that you were adopted?
I always knew I was adopted. I can't remember when Mum and Dad first told me, but I always knew. And I always remember them saying to me, "You were adopted, but you're very special. We especially went to get you. We wanted you so badly. We went to the doctor and we got you." So I always knew, but I didn't, to begin with, consider it a negative thing.
They literally did go to the doctor and get you, didn't they?
They literally did.
It's a very different adoption now than it was in the late 50s?
1961.
Early 60s.
It's very different now. So Mum and Dad worked for an accounting firm. So Dad was working of a night time. They were working during the day, working very, very hard. And the people that they worked for knew the doctor and knew that Mum and Dad couldn't have children. So the doctor had a baby, who was me.
Available,
that's right, in the hospital. And Mum and Dad just turned up one Saturday morning on the recommendation of the people that they worked for. And literally the doctor handed me over and they took me home, and that was it. Like, it's bizarre and really... it's changed, obviously, as it should, but that's how it happened.
Many years later, you tracked down your biological mother. Was she happy to see you? Happy to hear from you?
No, she was not. In 1992, I think it was, they changed the legislation, and so people who'd been adopted could get their real adoption certificate. And I was really angry about the fact that I could not find out who I was. I couldn't understand why mothers were given the preference over the children, why mothers' identities were hidden and therefore children's identities had to be hidden. And as I grew older and my dad got sick with cancer, I had my own son, and that all happened around about the same time. And because Dad was dying, I started to think, well, these people who had me might also be dying. And then they changed the legislation. I was almost first in line to get my certificate. There was my mother's maiden name. There was her place of birth. And I immediately started looking and eventually found her sister, who said to me on the phone, she will not be happy to hear from you. And
How did that feel?
I suppose I kidded myself thinking that, oh, no, I was right with this. I know that she might not want to. I kidded myself thinking that it would be all right. And I kidded myself thinking that what I was really after was just information. But of course, underneath there was also some kind of wish for some kind of relationship, some kind of acknowledgement. Because I remember when I was on the phone to her, when I rang.
What was that phone? Like, how did you gear yourself up to make that phone call? Where were you?
So I was living, my dad, I think my dad had either just passed or he was very close to passing away. And I'd moved back to Newcastle to help my mum look after him because he wanted to die at home. And I had Jono, who was 4 years old. And during the week, we were living in this little flat in Lambton in Newcastle, and I would go out and look after Dad at Mum's house, and then Mum would look after him on the weekend. And Mum came to my flat in Newcastle, and she was really supportive. And I didn't think about it a lot. I just desperately wanted to know. And I know I shouldn't have done it, but I did. I just rang.
And what was the response on the other end?
It was really, really awful. I can't tell you how awful it was. She was screaming at me saying, I don't want to know who you are. I put that time behind me. That was the worst time of my life. I don't want to know who you are. I don't want to know anything about you. And she kept calling me Miss Hull. I don't want to know who you are, Miss Hull. I don't want to know about your child. I don't want to know who you are. And she was so cold and so separate. And it felt as if I was to blame for this terrible thing that had happened to her. And she also made me feel really cheap. And I'm not quite sure. I do remember, actually. I was going to say I can't remember why she made me feel cheap, but one of the things she said to me was, if you're after money, you're not going to get it.
Oh, my God.
And we have very good lawyers. And in fact, and I remember thinking, my mum and dad were quite well off by that time. They'd worked very hard. And I had already done my undergraduate degree and I was just about to do a master's degree, and I had Jono. And I consider myself a certain kind of person. That sounds awful, but I did. And she made me feel like cheap and
grabby.
Yeah, and unworthy. And I remember saying to her, I just want to know where I'm from, who my father is, what the medical background is, what my cultural background is, what the story is.
Who you are.
Yeah, who I am.
Where you came from.
Yeah. And she just couldn't get past. It felt to me like I feel sometimes that maybe I shouldn't put her down too much because she has her own story. But I felt it was very much about her and that this was about something she wanted to forget. And I was that thing that she wanted to, that event in her life.
How did you react?
So I immediately fell into the chair and started crying. And I wrote about this in the book. Mum just picked up the phone, grabbed it, and she just kept saying over and over and over again, Susan's a good girl, she's a good girl. She just wants to know where she comes from. And
that broke my heart, that idea of, every child in moments fantasizes that they might be adopted and there's this perfect mother out there.
Yeah.
You really were adopted. And of course I imagine that you had fantasies and thoughts about what she might be like and what that reunion might be like. And so many of the adoption stories we hear are very positive ones.
Mm.
How do you recover from that?
So I got really angry. So
after the grief?
Yeah, I suppose it was a few months. Like, it's well over 20 years now. It's almost 30 years.
So you were in your late 20s.
Yeah, and I just had Jono. So he was
and you would have been proud. Like,
I
you would have wanted
so proud.
your mum to know, I've got this beautiful boy and I'm successful and I'm getting my master's. Be proud of me, Mum.
Yeah. And, you know, my dad's dying, so it's really important to me. I've had my child, and on the other hand, my dad is dying. So it's this pivotal moment in my life. And Jono didn't really look like me, and it was very, very important to me to see somebody else who looked like me, because you kind of feel like you've just been made up and put in this spot and there's nothing behind you. You've just been plonked down and there's nothing tethering you to anywhere. And I was so proud of Jono. And as a mother, I couldn't breastfeed. So I remember, I would hold up the little scoops of formula and use the knife and just make them perfect across, because it was so important to me that Jono had everything. Like, he was everything to me. And so my love for him compared to her lack of love for me and her reaction to me, the juxtaposition was extraordinary.
So you turned up on her doorstep. I shouldn't laugh. It's terrible. But
No, it is.
Like, thinking now, you think, well, that wasn't a great idea.
No, it wasn't.
But it was an act of desperation.
But it was 20 years later. So I wrote her a letter after that first phone call in 1992, I'm going to say. And in my letter, I was furious, and I said, I have rights, you need to tell me these things. And that's when she sent me the letter back saying, oh, your father's an IRA fundraiser. He and I travelled all around Australia raising money. We stopped at Newcastle, to have you, and then we kept going around. And
the IRA, for people who don't know, is like a terrorist organisation, a domestic terrorist organisation in Ireland.
Yes. So
that's a weird story.
That is such a weird story. And I didn't even know that existed. I knew it existed in America because a lot of Irish people had gone to America, but I didn't realise it happened in the 60s in Australia. So that whole letter to me felt like a total fabrication, that she was just making this story up just to kind of fob me off. And so after that letter, and I could never find him, she thought he was this name or that name, and I looked and could never find him. So I gave up. I gave up till 2012 because I thought, I'm never going to find anything. I certainly could not face her again. She really intimidated me and she really frightened me. And she made me feel so cheap. Cheap's the only word I can think to use. So I didn't want to face her again.
And yet you did.
So 20 years later, things were very different. Liz, my best friend, was dying. And that was terrible. Sorry. You do have an ability to put your finger on a spot.
I'm so sorry for what you've been through.
So she was dying, and my mum had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And I met Wayne, and Wayne said, let's go to Spain. I love you. I can give you everything you want. And I realised, because Liz had died and because Mum was so sick, that if I didn't try one last time, I would never know. And he was an incredibly strong man, and he said, I've got your back. We'll go up there. We'll sort it out. It'll be all fine.
How long had you guys been together at this time?
Not very long. He was also a Gemini and probably more impulsive than me, if
How
anything.
Did you meet?
Online. He was looking just for someone to have dinner with, and I suppose I was looking for a bit of diversion. Work was really hard. The children's lives were very hard. And so I went online and he went online at the same time, and I was out in the Central West and he was in Orange. And in that actually, just a little tip, if anyone's looking to meet someone, Central West is a great place because there's more men than there are women.
Oh.
So I was lucky. I was just in the right place at the right time.
He was lucky too.
He was, thank you. So, yeah, we met online and we met physically very soon afterwards.
How old were you both when you met?
So I'm not real good with maths, but I think I was around about 52, 53, and he was 57 or 58.
So you'd both lived life. You had you had one child, or you
just one child?
Yeah. So you'd had a previous relationship.
Yes.
And what did you know about his background?
Not a lot. I really jumped in with both feet. He told me a little bit about his background, about him growing up in New Guinea and how abusive his father had been to him. But really, maybe it was one conversation, maybe two. But he obviously didn't want to talk about it, and I didn't want to push him. And the things that he told me about his father, like literally, the children were brought back to Australia. Wayne was 5, I think, and his younger brother and maybe one other child were brought to Australia and by Wayne's mother. And the father, who was very dominant in the highlands in New Guinea, he made one of his relatives take the children out for an afternoon. So Wayne's mum thought they were going for ice cream, and literally put them on the plane and took them back to New Guinea. And I remember my overwhelming, when he told me that, was for his mother, because when she went back to New Guinea, the father, and the way things were back then, legally and socially, he made sure that she could not access the children.
Wow. So Wayne and his siblings grew up without access to their mum.
Yeah.
So a lot of shared sort of trauma among you both, and he then backed you to go and visit your mother in person before you both decided to move to Grenada to start this new life.
And also my father, and face some other people that I probably needed to face. I think growing up adopted, you are a people pleaser. I'm still a people pleaser, although I'm trying really hard to.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, it's well documented that children who are adopted are terrified of being sent back. So they're given to somebody. They have to behave in the very best way they can and do everything right so that they're kept.
Oh,
and
that's heartbreaking.
There's studies about this. Like it's a really well-known, within people who study that kind of stuff. So all your life you are trying really hard to be loved. That's what it's all about.
What was it like setting eyes on your mother for that first time? How did you get the courage to knock on her door?
I felt I got the courage, and I remember as I was running across the road, I was so terrified because I was really scared of her. But I also knew that if I didn't do it, I would never do it and I would never know, So I really, really had to do it, even though I was so scared. And it was amazing seeing somebody that looked like me for a start. She really did. There were resemblances, the size of our shoulders, our colouring, her eyes. So that was extraordinary to see somebody who looked like me. But also I could read her expression, and it was both an amazing thing and a terrible thing.
She didn't know you were coming.
No, she didn't, and that was bad. I know that was bad.
You must have still had fantasies of her throwing her arms around you when she saw you.
Yeah, I did, and I thought if I face her. If she doesn't know I'm coming and I face her, she'll have to tell me stuff. She'll have to give me the information that I want, because I still knew nothing, 20 years later, and I still knew nothing because the letter had seemed so so much of a fantasy. And because I could never find my father off the names that she'd given me.
Did she invite you inside?
Oh, God, no. She slammed the door in my face. And after giving me the name of a man who she claimed was my father, I remember her husband stood there. We were in the rain outside. There was screaming and it was like on one side of the fence was she and on the other side of the fence was me. And I realised that I was never going to get more than what she was giving me that afternoon, which was the name supposedly of my father.
And it was a different name to the one that she'd given you before.
Yeah, it was a different name to the one she'd given me in the letter. But by this time we had Google. So when she'd first given me all those names, that was where I would go to the post office and look, because we had no way of checking those names, or I had no way of checking those names. So you'd go through all the post books at the post office. But now I had Google. So race back, open the laptop. There he is, the man that she said was my father. Famous, semi-famous, certainly famous enough to be on Google, on the internet, AFL player from Melbourne. And then, checking a little bit more, yes, he'd been in the same place as my mother around about the same time as I was born. He was playing country football. So, that's it. There, I think I have the story.
But he wasn't your dad.
No, he wasn't.
It's hard to...
And it's funny. I know there are parts that are funny.
Yes, because what's extraordinary, and you write so beautifully about this in the book, is that you discover that your mother had actually had two daughters within 18 months, adopted them both out. They were both named Susan, and this was the father of the other Susan who she'd had and adopted out.
That's right.
So you went on to meet the other Susan, who was your sister.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
So she actually looked more like me than my mother. So even sitting there, I went to Melbourne and we had coffee, and we were sitting there, and I remember the waitress came over to get us coffee, and she said something like, "Oh, it's so nice for two sisters to have time to have coffee together." So it was the first time anyone had acknowledged a physical appearance between me and somebody else, and also the biological link that we shared. So it was amazing. She was a very soft person, and she felt like my sister, to tell you the truth. We did understand each other to a certain extent, but she didn't have the lust for knowledge like I did. She didn't want to know about our mother. She didn't even want to know the name of her father, who I knew, but she did not know.
Had she had a similar experience with your mother of being rejected, or she hadn't even tried?
No, she hadn't tried, but she had much more documentation than what I had. There was a whole lot of documentation from the hospital at the time where she'd been relinquished, where our mother's parents, our grandparents, had wanted to adopt her. Even my mother's sister had wanted to adopt the other Susan, but our mother didn't want that. She wanted Susan
gone.
Gone, yes, gone. And so from those notes, the other Susan knew that Enid, the woman that I call my birth mother in the story, wasn't a very nice woman. She'd already deduced that.
Yeah. So she protected herself by not.
She did, yeah. And
reaching
I respect that. And I respect that. At the end of the conversation, I said to her, "Look, I know who your father is," because I thought he was my father. And she declined knowing. She didn't want that information.
Wow.
And I know.
Imagine having that information
right there
at your fingertips, and saying, "No, I don't
Yeah.
want that."
I know, it was really, I understand and I don't understand. It's not me, but it was definitely her. And so we met and we connected, and I saw somebody who, we could have almost been twins.
How did that relationship develop?
No, so in a month so I thought I'd give her some time. I rang back, but no, that she didn't want any more contact with me.
That must have been heartbreak on heartbreak on heartbreak.
No, look, I respect her because at least she met me and at least we talked and at least we made that connection, and then she made a decision, not like my mother who just said no from the outset and would not move in her position at all. Susan at least met me and we talked, and that
Did she
was her
explain
decision.
why?
She so there's two kinds of people who are adopted. There are the people like me who are desperate to know, and then there are the other kind of people who want to stay where they are. They don't want to hurt the people who've adopted them. They don't want to risk that second rejection. Just happy with what I've got. I'm going to be thankful for what I've got. I'm going to stay here.
Because it's a big complicating factor, isn't it? It's like there's you and then there's Jono and then there's Wayne and then there's it's a lot to take on. I've seen it in friends of mine who've discovered siblings. It can be a wonderful thing, but it's highly disrupting whatever way you look at it.
And it's highly complex.
Yeah.
It's so...
And emotional.
Yeah. And, it sounds awful, but I feel like I got from her what it was I was looking for. I found her, I met her, I saw the resemblance, I found out what her story was, and so that satisfied me.
You did eventually find your father and your biological father, and Wayne came with you to meet him. He was in Perth, wasn't he?
He was in Perth, and I would never have met him other than the fact that my other, this is so complicated, my other stepsister or half-sister who'd been a baby when he'd left his wife and the children that he'd already had to run around Australia with my biological mother. So he left children behind when he ran off, and he left some kind of criminal past behind. Anyway, I contacted her because I eventually found out his former name. Went looking for people with his former name. There she was. She said to me, Mary is her name. She said, he's living in Perth and he's still living under an alias. So he had been with my mother when they'd been travelling around Australia. He'd been under an alias because he was running away from a criminal past and because he was working for the IRA. So
that was true.
That was true. Yeah, that was true. And he was still under an alias. So I would never, ever have found him unless Mary had told me what his alias was.
And he turned out...
very complicated, I'm sorry.
He turned out to be a total creep.
Oh, he was awful. So he said, we'll meet in this pub at lunchtime. It'll be quiet. We'll be able to talk. And so Wayne and I walked into this pub and literally there were people spilling out onto the road. There was an Irish band playing. There were tourists there. It was so crowded. And I never thought in a million years we would find him or chat. And I remember looking across the room and it was like when you look at somebody you know now and there's an old photograph there from when they were children and you can see the resemblance still, it's still there. And as soon as I looked at him, I knew him. And I have a photograph of he and I together and the resemblance is quite strong. But he was such a sleazebag and... he was an asshole. He was a liar. He was kind of sitting on the fence. Half of him was saying, yes, I was with her in Newcastle. Yes, she told me that she was pregnant. But no, she told me that she'd got it seen to, were his words. And those words are burned into my brain. And I'm like, well, here I am. She obviously didn't get it seen to, because you and her were together in a car travelling around Australia together, running from the police, obviously living in very tight circumstances. How could you not know that she'd had a child? So
And he weirdly almost tried to crack onto you.
yeah, he did. I know, it's disgusting. And Mary had said to me from Melbourne that he was
That's his daughter.
that's his
Your
my half
half-sister.
Yeah. So that is his daughter.
Had she warned you that he was not very nice?
She had. And in fact, so had my biological mother. In that first letter, she had said that he was not a very nice man. But
you still hope.
Yeah, you still hope, and you still think, well, maybe those people's judgments aren't 100%. But I was really curious about the IRA thing, and is this whole story about them travelling around Australia on the run? It's such a fanciful story. And it was true. And I got that from him. I got that information from him. It was true. And I do believe he was my father. There's no doubt. So, yeah.
With all of this, I guess, behind you, but still swirling around and very much present, you and Wayne decided to move to Spain, to Granada. How long had you been together? And that's a big move to make.
It's a massive move. What I didn't realise first up was that Wayne had had cancer previously and had recovered, and also I think had heart issues, but he didn't really talk about it. So for him, it was very much about living in the moment. He felt that he'd finally found a woman that he could love and who would love him. He talked about me being the love of his life, and of course that's all I'd ever wanted. All I'd ever wanted was to be loved by somebody, especially somebody who I saw as really good looking, responsible, kind, generous. I always remember him saying, "I've got your back." And he would say that all the time. And even he would put his hand in the small of my back. So I always felt very, very supported. And I'd travelled before and lived overseas before and worked overseas before. And for me, that was always the high point of life, to be able to travel and to live in a different culture and learn.
In part 2 of my No Filter conversation with Susan, we speak about the story of the unexpected love affair that she began a few years ago, later in her life, after her first marriage ended. She was already a single mum. And we also talk about the twist that made her doubt everything about her identity all over again. It's an amazing story. Keep an eye out in your feed. We'll be dropping that episode later this week. Susan's book is called The Love That Remains, and you can find it in any bookstore. And this is a bit of a tangent, but please try to support your local bookstore wherever you can. If you like the experience of going into a bookstore and browsing and looking at the things on the shelf, the only way that bookstores are going to survive is if we actually don't order everything online all the time, and sometimes go into bookstores whenever we can and support them. Small businesses like bookstores really need us to survive. No Filter was produced by Melanie Tait, and for more Mamamia podcasts, we have dozens. You can go to mamamia.com.au/podcasts.